Hi, everybody. Good evening, and I want to thank you all for your patience for the second week. I know with the on-demand videos, just wanted to just kind of follow up on a few concepts. This is really more organic. So I think this is just reflection of kind of the feedback that I receive from speaking with you all individually, as well as in the weekly meetings as well. So I think there were a few concepts that I wanted to circle back on when it came to organizing, because I emphasized this quite a bit in the beginning, and I want to move on to actual discussion about the research. The thing is that with research is that time is the biggest thing, right? Organization. And the thing is that it's not like as if you have protected time in your career. I mean, you are we are all 100% clinical until otherwise. So the thing is that, and even when you have protected time, quote unquote protected time for research, you never really quite have that. There's always other things that kind of intercede with that. And in your training, that oftentimes maybe you're maybe on a quote unquote research block and you get pulled for clinical duties. So that's going to happen. So, it is a challenge. I do concede that it is a challenge. And I think what I'm designing here is, I don't think this is going to take an hour, but what I want to do is kind of highlight some thoughts, and hopefully that these are some concepts that I think can be useful for you. So I think that the best way I've thought about organizing time is, I think about, right, there's 168 weeks or 168 hours in a week. And I think one of the things that happens is that I mentioned this in the last session, that willpower will decline during the course of the day. There's a lot of science and a lot of studies, if you will. Maybe how much you want to put your faith into the science on it is a whole other thing altogether. But one thing that I think is important is kind of like, I think the best approach to this is thinking about your time as your biggest resource, right? If you think about it like money, there are many things financially that you would talk about, that you would yeah, the best strategy is diversification, right? So you want to diversify, and I think that the same goes with time. Whether it be you're studying a subject, and maybe your weaker subject, you probably want to spend more time on, because you might still stand to gain a lot more from that when it comes to subjects in a test. Maybe it's a skill set that you want to devote more time to, like a kinesthetic skill, procedurally. But what you want to do is the idea of diversification of your time. I mentioned in the last session, again, is there a hard set rule, like your 10 to 15% of your working hours? If you're logging your time, I know you'll logging your hours is something that you have to do as part of your accreditation for your residency program. But the thing when it comes specifically to if you think about your time, that, let's just say for simplicity and purposes, 80 hours. When you have 80 hours, the idea is that you're going to have, there is a saying, and I had this in the research wiki, that there's a productivity leveling off, where after about 50 hours it kind of levels off between 50 to 55 hours, and then afterwards it kind of declines. So why do you work 80 hours a week or more than that? That's a separate conversation altogether. But what I want to point out is the idea is that you only have, in terms of productive time, how many of you all spent time in college studying all night, or doing all these things where you're cramming for a test? While that might get you to passing the exam, long-term retention is not the best. So the best strategy really is, when organizing your time, consider this principle here of dividing your time accordingly. So you might want to consider in a week. Let's just say, okay, you have 80 hours in a week, and 50 of those hours are spent clinically. So I would say, like, you want to spend 10% of your time. So let's say you have 5 hours in a week to do research, just for the purposes of this example. Now, some of that time that you might want to spend is, you want to spend some time in the blue here on a given task. Maybe you want to set aside some time for writing. Maybe you want to set aside some time for reviewing the literature and seeing, what comes. And then maybe you want to devote some time to growth. So what do I mean by growth? Well, let's just say that you're proficient in writing. You're really good in writing, but maybe you're weak in statistical analysis. So one thing that you decide to do is develop your skills in statistical analysis. You start beginning to learn how to do statistical analysis, whether it be whatever software of choice, and you're working with somebody who's a proficient in that. Likewise, the person who's proficient in doing statistical analysis might want to improve on their writing skills, or maybe they could learn something about how to review the literature. Maybe there's different strategies that they could learn. So this is again, one of the biggest concepts that I think is that really in a resource-rich environment where you all are your best teachers and you all learn from one another. So the idea with growth is that is the best way of analogy is speculative, right? Maybe in diversification where you're devoting 10% to something that's speculative. Now that 10%, that time spent, so if you say 5 hours, which is 300 minutes, and you just take 10% of that, so say a half hour, may not be enough time, but maybe you just play around with a different strategy. Maybe you learn some keyboard shortcuts to help get you through in something. Maybe you watch something on YouTube. But the idea is that you figure out for yourself, and then maybe what you also consider doing is if you find something that really helps to accelerate your productivity, you can sharing that with the group too as well. Exchange of ideas is extremely important because I think that this enables everybody to learn to become better. And one thing that I can personally attest to in my own growth and development has been the relentless pursuit where I will continuously reflect and refine the process for what I'm doing. If something will take me maybe 2 or 3 minutes, if I could get that done in half the time or even like a fraction of the time with a shortcut, then that's something to consider. So I don't have a particular answer for that, but it's just something for you to consider. I'm happy to bounce off ideas and problem solving because I think one of the things that a resource that I can do is I've learned how to be resourceful because that's something that's a skill that goes beyond research. By the way, I think it goes very well in the lab. If you're looking in a cardiac catheterization and you're faced with a stenosis that appears significant or might be a lesion that is a bifurcation lesion, for example, and you have to consider maybe a two-wire strategy, that requires a little more forethought and planning. That is a very niche example. That's obviously the top of my mind is in rotating in a cath lab. But what I'm pointing out is that these are skills that maybe what you're applying in research and learning how to problem solve that are going to serve you very well clinically too as well. And that's one thing that I didn't really appreciate as much about research, but I think with the experience I have now is very helpful. So take careful inventory of your time. Maybe this strategy comes back to time blocks. So if you're time blocking for specific tasks, set aside. Many times what I say with writing is writing is great for larger time blocks. If you have a large uninterrupted time, let's say you have an afternoon off and you have an hour or 2 hours, maybe that's prime time where you can set the timer to 25 minutes or 53 minutes or whatever flow you want to achieve, and just write with no distractions. Put it down on paper. We'll get to the idea about, by the way, putting things down on paper, because I think that's also important because there is a little bit of inertia when it comes to doing that. But the idea of avoiding interruption is to avoid mode switching too often, because if you get interrupted by emails, by messages, that's going to disrupt that flow. And there's studies that show that with the brain that it does take some time to retrace that again. So you really want to try to identify your time beforehand and try to find those times where it might lend itself. If you have pockets of time that you don't are unexpected, maybe during the day, it's a slow day, then maybe that's a good time to peruse the literature. Maybe that's a good time to do those things. I think speculatively, it might be towards the end of your day when maybe your energy is not so great. So decide, okay, for fun, I'm just going to go on YouTube, or it's like on Thursday or Friday. It's like, I really wonder if there's a way I can do this better, or I can do this quicker. So that is the biggest thing, because I think one thing, if I look back on, is I spent a lot of time doing a lot of time I would consider in hindsight wasted. But I think also part of the other thing too, when I say the time wasted, is I'm reflecting and I'm looking back and saying, boy, you know what? I think if I were to do this again, I would do this differently now. So that's something that I want to highlight. And as I mentioned before, your attention may fade with time. Maybe you're fresh in the day, and it's easier to set aside tasks that are more menial to later in the day when your energy is not quite all the way down to zero, because otherwise you might end up putting off those tasks, which is another thing. But just as an experiment, consider budgeting your weekly time allocation. Identify those blocks in your time that you might see that are going to be more contiguous, and set aside the time for cognitive heavy tasks. So identify what task might be more cognitive heavy for you. Some people that might be analysis, and some people that may not be because they already have a program that can already do all those things. So, and that's where specialization comes in. But I think in your growth and research, one thing that can be very helpful in terms of adding to your arsenal and diversifying your own arsenal is to be able to, is to maybe exchange ideas and reflect with one another. So identify areas in which you can potentially grow and actively seek out how you can improve. So that would include me, and that might include other resources too as well. Another concept that I had mentioned earlier, and I shared this in the group chat, are SMART goals. So in the weekly meetings, I think what's very helpful. One of the things with meetings is that they tend to be unproductive, and there are often times where the common meme goes around. This could be an email. So I think that what is helpful. There are some things that are beneficial when it comes to meetings, and I think the accountability part is key. But the other thing too that's also a challenge is that, well, okay, now you had this great meeting and you're ready to go and you have all this thing. What do you do next? So I think that the SMART goals is a very good approach. There are many different approaches, by the way. These are not. I don't want to say that they're verbatim, but that there are many different ways of approaching it. This is just one approach. Find an approach that works for you. But I think it's good to maybe when you come out of a meeting or come out of a week, to identify to yourself what are the goals that I need to achieve in a given time frame. So specific goals. So you want your goal to be specific and narrow to effectively be able to execute what you're trying to do. It has to be measurable. Okay, so you want to see. Okay, for example, let's just say that the one example that we would talk about with a meta-analysis is generation of a table 1. So creating a table 1 and just starting with that and compiling the resources. So incrementally, you're getting to where you need to be. Ultimately, such a table is likely going to be a figure in either in both an abstract as well as a planned manuscript. So it's good to start generating some progress towards what you need to do. So something that's measurable, something that's achievable. So you want to make sure that you reasonably accomplish the goal within a certain time frame. I know that I point out the Dr. Fusser's lecture about that you want to give yourself 1 month to write. Now with research, the projects can go on indefinitely, and it really is, nobody has the deadline like you have. So you want to really get a sense of, okay, well, how much time do I have? If there's a conference that I'm aiming to submit an abstract to, it's best to have a deadline maybe 1 week or 2 weeks beforehand. Why do I say that? Because you want to give your co-author some time to review it. They might not be on the same wavelength as you are. They might be busy with, they might have a more busier time. There might be other things going on. So you want to give themselves plenty of time, and you want to give yourself plenty of time too as well to make sure that everyone's eyes gets on it. Because the other important thing when you in authorship is it's no small commitment. Yes, it's great to be a co-author, but you are owning up that your work is original, and that you stand by the work, that by the fidelity that the work that's been done. So giving everyone enough time to review it is very important. Relevant. So your goals should align with your values and long-term objectives. So many of you are doing research for the purposes of obtaining a clinical fellowship. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that what you're aiming for, that the goals are moving you in that direction that you want to be. And then T is time-based. So set a realistic but ambitious end date to clarify task prioritization and increase motivation. That's part of the generation with the weekly meetings, is that this way kind of has some accountability. So rather than the notion of taking the notion of a meeting where it's like this could be an email, I think what might connect, a better way of connecting is really kind of the weekly interactions in which maybe with live sessions. Now, are you going to be able to make every live session? No, I understand there are a lot of things. I myself sometimes time-wise will have to flex things. But I think a good approach that I've seen in online programs are things where you're working asynchronously, and maybe that's where the idea of cloud-based documents, WhatsApp groups, just one-on-one messages can be helpful, and then also on demand so that you all can watch this at different times. So So I think the combination of these things helps you all hopefully to be able to get to those next steps of where you want to be. And so that's why I'm doing this on a Saturday. I've had some time to be able to get this done. I meant to do this in the past, but I think with my other duties and responsibilities, it becomes a bit challenging. So, but it's setting aside the time, right? And I'm giving an example for myself where, for example, this past Wednesday, I just gave a lecture that I was putting together on heart failure. Now I want to make some changes and updates and everything. So I think it's just the example I'm personally giving is that we all have things that are going on, and it's just trying to find a way of how can you achieve what you want to achieve, and just setting aside those mileposts. And so that brings to the next point here. So this is a challenge that many times in research in which things might stagnate. So people might feel overwhelmed. Where do I begin? What if I'm doing it wrong? But the key is sometimes it's just to dive in. So you want to break up the tasks as mentioned before into measurable amounts, take inventory of your time, see what you can reasonably achieve and aim to achieve it in set time. Great. So you've done all these things and you achieve it. Now, not 100% of the time are you going to always be able to achieve what you want, what you set out to do, right? That's life. So one important thing to also look at, and I think this is probably very critical for everybody, including myself, when you are unsuccessful, reflect back why and where you can improve. Okay, sometimes there might be things in which something doesn't go right. Okay, maybe it's a clinical case that there was a complication that you didn't expect it to when you're seeing a patient. Maybe it's in a procedure. But what you want to do to improve is really actively reflect back and see where you can improve. So the same concept applies with your SMART goals. Did you set your goals too broadly? Did you try to take on too much at one time? Did you not have enough time allocated to the task? Maybe you realize, okay, this task requires a lot more time, or maybe I just don't have this skill set, or maybe there's a knowledge gap. So that's important, and I think that's where the mentorship part comes in, and that's where it can be very helpful in doing that. So having gone through that, I know it's been a lot of stuff on productivity. Great. So now let's focus on the research question, because I think in order to get things going is really trying to compress things in a way where, being laser focused. I think one thing that I've talked about with someone is how to accomplish what you need to do. Yeah, you really need to really have a good focus and really have a good commitment on it. Now, again, there's a deadlines. If you have different deadlines for a conference, or it's good to have a manuscript also at the same time too as well. The reason why I say this is that there are many times in which you might set out to do a manuscript after you've submitted the abstract, but there's no time as well, because maybe there's another project that maybe comes up, and then this ends up getting sidelined. So then you start forgetting things. It's always good to kind of start generating both the manuscript and the abstract at the same time when possible. So you want to, that's what you want to do, but when it comes to research and generating research ideas, this is where I want to start talking about is you want to identify the area you would like to focus on. And so what is the outcome? Who's the population which you're studying, and what are you comparing? So basically, this is the PICO or PICOT format. This is a good way to start generating a question. And basically any question, whether you're doing a meta-analysis, whether you're doing a randomized controlled trial, whether you're doing a single center retrospective study, I think this is a universal principle and that you're looking to explore. So the PICOT format, so P population, who are you studying, right? So I'll give an example of if we're looking at, for example, of ratio of biomarkers, and looking at those biomarkers, and we're looking in the population. So let's look at this, right? If you're looking at this ratio, you're looking at a population, so that you want to see what the outcome is. And so the intervention is, okay, well, among those those who might have acute coronary syndrome or heart failure, and you're comparing the two of them together, and the outcome is you want to assess, okay, well, were they found to have obstructive coronary disease, and did they undergo PCI? Now, the challenge is, of course, with STEMI, by definition, is that upon revising this, we realized with STEMI is that, okay, well, that if there's a culprit lesion, there's no question on that. So that's where in refining the question of the population who we're looking to study, it's not just everybody who undergoes a CAP. Because everyone that undergoes a CAP, some of them are going to, some of them might be STEMIs. So that might bias, right? Because you know that with that, more than likely it's gonna, well, assuming of course that it's obstructive disease. But the idea of when you're looking at the sample is that you're looking at those who underwent cardiac catheterization. Why do I say that those who underwent cardiac catheterization versus those who do not? Well, it's going to be difficult to compare those because your population sample size and what you're aiming to do here is you want to compare those of, okay, did they undergo PCI or not, right? And to undergo PCI, you have to, by definition, have coronary angiography. It wouldn't make sense to include people that didn't undergo a cardiac catheterization because PCI would not even be into the equation. And not everybody who undergoes a coronary angiography, who undergoes a cardiac catheterization, will end up getting PCI. Sometimes it's non-obstructive disease, and that might be, and that's part of the genesis of this project here. So the key here is to really refine the question. This is kind of a more of a superficial overview in which I'm going over this, but you really want to characterize who are you studying, right? So people that present as an outpatient is going to be a different story, right? If they present as an outpatient, that's not an unplanned cardiac hospitalization. They're coming in, they may not always have the biomarkers of interest. So if you don't have the biomarkers of interest, you're not going to be able to characterize that ratio. And so that's not going to be useful as well. So what you want to do is you want to have the important data points that you're going to be able to generate your analysis from. And you want to be able to draw a strong conclusion based on it. Because if you set out your sample of a 100, but only 70 of them really underwent angiography, then you're also going to be limiting yourself because your true sample size is actually going to be about 7 rather than 100. So that's going to make a big difference, as well as the proportion of the outcomes. So, and then the type of studies too as well. So this is just, again, focus more on the single center retrospective. Related projects, including such as the meta-analysis. These are things in which there's a shared resource where many of the references are going to be overlapping. And in this way, you're kind of becoming an expert in this given area. But when it comes to beginning research, you want to think to yourself, who exactly you're studying and what are you aiming to study? Because there might be many different studies that will cover different elements and different aspects, but may not be relevant to your question at hand. So by having a clear understanding of what your question is, that's going to be able to help those around you to answer those questions. So why are you studying what you're studying? You want to create a background. Now, this background may very well be an introduction that you might have if you are writing a IRB proposal. It might be if you're running an NIH-style grant, and it might be in the introduction of your manuscript. So very much the background often begins with an opening statement, okay, especially with a proposal. And what you want to try to do is consider this. You're applying for something the same way, maybe like a personal statement, if you will. So you really want to try to capture the attention of those. You want to get them to understand, okay, especially if you're looking for funding. If you're looking for funding, you really want to really solicit in a way of like, well, why is this important? And of all the proposals, why should maybe this agency offer me over everybody else the opportunity to conduct this research? So you want to have a well-articulated opening statement or the proposal where you grab the reader's attention. Maybe that might be things like acute coronary syndrome is one of the most prevalent causes of hospitalization in the United States, or acutely compensated heart failure, a combination of the two. Maybe you're talking about, for example, acute coronary syndrome is a significant contributor of morbidity and mortality in the United States. If you read enough introductions, you get the flavor for what opening statement might look at. You then move into what's currently known. So what we do know currently right now, that there are different assays and different peptides that we use, followed by what and where there might be some gaps in knowledge or things that are less clear or unknown. Maybe these are things in guidelines, where the guidelines that maybe there's a lack of a consensus. Maybe that level of consensus falls under expert opinion, or maybe it's a few observational studies in which they've explored. One example that came to mind is a case we were looking at is the utility of direct oral anticoagulants in coronary aneurysms. So there might be a knowledge gap in a given area there. So what you want to try to identify is, okay, well, what do we know about the subject now? And what are some areas in which maybe it's less known? Maybe, for example, a new medicine that's come onto the market in the last couple of years, SGLT2 inhibitors. Maybe we don't know about the diuretic effect as much. That was a question reportedly with anecdotally that sacubital valsartan may have a diuretic effect, and there might be some osmotic diuresis associated with SGLT2 inhibitors. So could the potential of combinations, especially now that they're in the guidelines, result in more diuresis? And should we back down on Lasix or maintenance dose diuretics? So that might be something to look at too as well. But what you're trying to do is you're exploring what do we know and what do we not know. So what is less clear or unknown. And then what you want to talk about is your hypothesis. So what are you aiming to test? And usually an introduction when it comes to a manuscript, if you're looking at a 4,000 to 5,000 word manuscript, you're looking at probably a little bit over a page. So maybe around 10%. A lot of these times you might have 10 or 15 references in your background. So you want to put something down on paper. I think writing it down, yes, there's a lot of, yes, I'm putting out a lot of thinking, but I think what's important is to write and rewrite. So you want to put something down on paper. It doesn't have to be great, doesn't have to be perfect, just put it down on paper. And that's one of the biggest pieces of advice that I've received, is just putting it down and really kind of iterative process in which you're working together. Because what tends to happen is the opposite problem, is if you write something, or maybe you're holding on to it too long, and you become so anchored into it that when it comes time to review it, because ultimately you're writing something not for yourself, you're writing something so that people are going to read it. Be it not just an editor, but people that are going to be looking, might be on PubMed or whatever index thing, but you're looking for something that you're aiming to get published. If you're aiming to get published, somebody else is going to be reading it. So consider very early on to have some experienced eyes, take a look at what you're writing, and to see where you can improve. Because I think that's probably where the feedback that I can offer, especially in live sessions, might be most beneficial. It's kind of like, okay, you have something, you have an idea, should you rephrase it? You know, is it too verbose? Is it too wordy? Can you contract it? Can you say it another way? Is it less clear? So there might be some things that I know that when I say or write something, that in my mind, I know what I'm talking about, but it doesn't come across that way to others. So that's an important point that you really want to consider, is that you might be clear in your own mind, but that bias can be pretty strong. So I encourage to get things down on paper. Doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, just get something down on paper, have people take a look at it, and then work together early on, because that's how you can develop it, is refining the process. I think the best analogy, and I thought about this, because in 2018 I went out to bourbon country in Kentucky, and yeah, I was just very entranced by the refining process. They talk about distilling and everything. And I think the same principle applies when you're writing, is that if you're writing something down on paper, is that you're writing something and maybe it's crude. Then you're refining it more and more until it flows better, or, you know, so you want to get as many eyes on it, because ultimately what you're going to end up doing is it's not going to be your principal investigator or your mentor or whomever that's writing it that's going to be most critical. It's going to be the editor or editors that are in the review process, and you want to have your work get accepted. So it's good to have a look at it, and the more you do it too as well, the more feedback you get, the stronger that I think you become as a scientific writer. And that's an important thing, not just when it comes to writing a manuscript, by the way, or writing an abstract, but maybe if you're aiming to write a letter, you're aiming to write for something, for a proposal or a personal statement. But all of these skills can work in many ways to help yourself. So those are all the topics. Actually, I realize we're at 30 minutes and I'm doing this on Zoom, so I have a 40-minute limit, but I hope you all found this helpful. Again, as more things come about, I will think about how I want to use the online format and the on-demand format to help you all out. And but I hope you all find this helpful, and hope you guys everything's going well with research, and reach out anytime. Thanks a lot.